When something is rather easy to explain, but isn't being explained, I think it's reasonable to have some suspicion of censorship or fear leading to the explanation being withheld. Of course, that's every man, woman, and child's right to keep to themselves something they're afraid is going to cause unjust punishment. But putting pieces together may be simplified if a person who understands the situation um, is more forthcoming. As a result, I've been doing my level best to be forthcoming and trustworthy in my representation of what I understand about what's happened. So, a few people who are attentive might have noticed that in light of the fact that about the time the Berlin Wall came down, Martha Gellhorn wrote to me. She opened up to me, as Richard Crane put it, a biographer of a friend of his, um, General Foucher. Richard Crane is a professor at Benedictine College. He congratulated me on having her open up to me. People who know Martha Gellhorn, her achievements, Ernest Hemingway dedicated for him Bell tools to her, realize that being written to by Martha puts a certain luster on your personage such that adversaries of rank are almost to be forgiven for being glad that they beat me up. She was an exceptional person. Well, people who know what she wrote to me about when I was living in Montana with a strawberry blonde from Maine realize that there's a duplicity between where I was coming from and where the world around me was setting up to proceed from. There was a disconnect, and I couldn't get anybody but Martha to talk to me about it. Um, but I do remember the discourtesy that was paid to Mikhail Gorbachev by John Tower, and I've never pardoned it. I've never understood how anybody could miss the rationality of the Russian narrative that proceeded from there to where we now are, which is a very sad and scary outcome given that America had once the support and love of wonderful people like Martha Eleanor Roosevelt, who was her dearly cherished friend, and her husband as President of the United States, to name a few people of distinguished character for whom the Kennedys could draw upon, Eisenhower could draw upon. We ended up with chicanery and insults to people who were being generous about reform. So, how did it happen that there was this disconnect that stayed disconnect and remains disconnect? And what does it mean for where we are? Has a lot to do with Václav Havel and Peter Gabriel, European intellectual giants who saw a macabre entanglement that they could use to squelch what really happened and create art from it that would be used as a mass deception lobby to evoke acceptance of the intolerable that I was reporting and testifying and trying to have police apprehend, um, which was that there was evidence that man made plans were behind the AIDS attack, which is what Martha wrote to me about. She was a very brave woman. She was very upfront. Is this what you are saying, Mr. Crary? Yes. So it looked a little bit like Russia was in on it because of their silence, and the Reagan administration was in on it because of their animosity and attempts to cover it up and justify it, and Bush and so on. At the time, I wasn't sure about Peter Gabriel and Václav Havel. My mind is made up they must have been in on it too. So, what do we see in the Ukraine? Well, here's what I think happened was that the people who did it saw parallel lines between what they had done and what the public was willing to allow said about what was happening. And Queen Elizabeth had an awful idea, an awfully brilliant, just awful idea. Now, once upon a time, my favorite band was King Crimson. And even though Martha did write to me, there were some other extraordinary things that went on in my life and in the background that I have that quite deserved more coverage than they received, simply because the storyline, the narrative of my evidence and testimony was ruled out. Right? Elizabeth had a better idea. Now, King Crimson is from England. And let's talk a little bit about society and culture. In America, we do have civilians in charge of government. Some of them have served honorably in the Navy, the Army, the Marines, the Air Force, the Peace Corps, the Coast Guard, the National Guard, and so on. Well, John Kennedy, for example, was injured and saved a man's life in the Pacific when his ship, the PT-109, was sunk. Reagan never did. He overcompensated with his warmongering from Hollywood. Um, but people jockey for position in our society. I understand Donald Trump rewarded somebody who gave him help changing a tire on his car. He paid a mortgage. There's winners, there's losers, there's lucky, and there's lucklessness in his world. Well, some people think that servicemen should get, Biden is of the mind that people who serve in the military should get priority in services like housing and so on. But there's also an element of nativism. We were here first, immigrants beware, and so on. And the military has this nativist streak where people believe the military is more wise and should have control of society. And so there's tension. MacArthur and Truman are a story of um, people on high who had a struggle for power between them, for decision-making powers between the civilian and military branches of government. So we see these some societies prefer military. Like we recently were excited to fear and laugh and hate about Russia by rock star and military outfit doing for conquest of Ukraine. Well, things like that have happened in the West before. My favorite band's sister appeared on 60 Minutes with Colin Powell, the maniac who announced the war in Iraq. And, I liked King Crimson for a long time. I mean, I thought the way they would, the eerie and way they would sing cigarettes, ice cream, Cadillacs, blue jeans was the bomb. I mean, I really thought that was great stuff. But, yeah, I have to part ways with their lies about what I lived through and understood and what happened. You know what I'm saying? So, what happened? Here's what I think they decided to do. They set up a parameter and they said, son, you know that the people who evade service aren't as good as you. We are all knights of resignation. So march out and do warrior to one another to show that you are the stuff, you know, and to inculcate the premise of like nobody is a non-conscript. Everybody must stand up for warriors, and to get that across the board. And they wait, Queen Elizabeth's awful idea, awfully brilliant, wonderful, awfully awful, just awful idea. Was after it right after COVID, so that people understood we're going to move on from here because it's clogged to climate change, right? So, oh, and they have people who wheedle from the narrative of Bush. Oh, he peeps at uh, Russian figure skaters. Well, Vileva is forever one of my great heroes. I mean, but I'm not saying her performance wasn't the same kind of craft of intelligence which I abhor. But it did lead me to the understanding of what this comes from, which was that dude from Kharkiv Wyspensky, who Ken Crimson's friends, knew. They were introduced to me as surely as Martha Gellhorn wrote to me. I was hanging out with Pierre Elliott once, who was one of the idiots in Paris with Gurdjieff. I mean, so I knew all these people, and I just didn't have it put together. So they pulled a Houdini with Lennon. That's what happened. And the spooky stuff was their macabre, um, spellbinding neon prophecy about how it's going to go. So we're all supposed to be King Crimson's Knights of Resignation. And you know what it is, of course, is chivalry towards, it was always in the name of chastity. It was always in the name of national security. It was all this hocus pocus, turning friend on friend in the name of country. The stuff. It's always been the same stuff. There's nothing new about it. They're not my favorite band anymore. I don't have a favorite band.